You have one side of the world where people talk about it's business, it's just business, it's a transaction. Like you have to sort of manage that. And then you have another set of people in the world that really view the relationships as non transactional. There's a lot more substance underlying the relationships, and they're friendships that survive failure. They're friendships that survive disappointment. They're friendships that survive things that don't go the way you think they would go.
Welcome to Technoventure. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Brad Feld. Brad has been an early stage entrepreneur and investor since 1987, 1 year before he completed his studies at MIT. He co-founded two venture capital firms, Foundry Group and Movius Venture Capital, and multiple companies, including Techstars, a company that helps founders scale their startups. He's also a managing director of Intensity Ventures. He's written several books, including Venture Deals and Startup Communities. His latest is Give First, the Power of Mentorship. Uh, Brad Feld, welcome to Technoventure. It's great to speak with you today.
Peter, thanks for having me.
That's a great pleasure. And as I mentioned in a prior conversation, Brad, I first heard of you from your uncle, Charlie Feld, who's been a great inspiration to me. The story about him is actually makes up the introduction of my third book, for example. Uh, and I think it's remarkable that two people that have become so influential in technology, admittedly in different parts of it, of course, emerge from so close in the family tree. Is there a reflection you have about how your family has developed its areas of focus and having technology as such an important part of this? Anything you learned from Charlie as a result of that, or perhaps he from you from your perspective?
Well, an enormous amount. And the evolution started young for me. We have a close family. Charlie and my dad, Stan, were very close as brothers. There's only two of them. My dad's a couple years older than Charlie. So growing up as a kid, I became very close to my younger brother, Daniel, and John and Kenny were Charlie's kids. And the four of us are very close friends. And to give a sense of that dynamic, that's the family group. If you wind the clock forward to today, about once a year, the six of us, Charlie, my dad, Daniel, John, and Kenny, go somewhere for a long weekend, 3, 4 days. And within the in the springtime, we just did spring training. So we rented an Airbnb in Phoenix. My dad got the experience of a Waymo for the first time. Charlie, John, Daniel, and Kenny had no interest in that experience. But we went to three baseball games and just sort of messed around. I mean, we're a pretty mellow group, so our idea of a good time is to go to sleep, at 8:30 or 9 o'clock after we've watched some sports on TV after we've had dinner. So it's that kind of a group. When I was so as a little kid, I was always spending time with Charlie, John, and Kenny, and obviously Daniel. Um, Charlie, I got interested in computers around age 12. And I got a Apple II computer for my bar mitzvah. And I would say even at that period of time, my exposure to computers was adjacent to Charlie's work at Frito-Lay at the time. There wasn't a chief information officer title yet or role. I don't remember what his initial title was, but it was like head of data processing or something. And I have a very, very, very visual memory of one of my first times I ever spent any time in front of a computer, which was in a Frito-Lay data center in Dallas. I don't remember what kind of computer it was, but it was through a terminal. And I went with Charlie for the day. He had something to do, all day. And I sat around in front of this terminal. He gave me a book. It was a black book that was about an inch thick. And the cover of the book was a programming language. And for people that know that book, that was the original APL guide. And APL was a super weird language with a relatively small number of characters. You could do just a remarkable amount of stuff with very, very tight coding. And that was the first programming language I played around with. And it was kind of just, he sat me in the corner and said, go play. And that happened over and over again through high school, where Charlie would bring me to things or let me be exposed to things that I had no business being exposed to. I went to MIT, and when I was in Boston and Cambridge, it was sort of the heyday of Lotus Development Corp and Digital Equipment Corp. And when Charlie would come through town, for whatever reason, he would invite me to the meetings. And so I ended up sitting in the meetings. He'd let me sit at the table. He wouldn't make me sit in the corner, and I'd be quiet and respectful. But every now and then I'd have a question or something. And he involved me in these things that he knew I was interested in, but he gave me exposure to them in a way that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Uh, there's a couple of arcs of that then played out professionally. The first was I started my first company in 1987. Charlie then ended up starting the Feld Group in 1992. My first company's name was Feld Technologies, so we're not very creative at naming companies. And interestingly, up to that point, I had really viewed Charlie as a mentor because I just learned so much from him in terms of being exposed in different ways. But the inverse of that was that all of a sudden Charlie's running his own consulting company, and he's asking me questions about dealing with and scaling up a consulting business. So the mentorship dynamic turned into a peer relationship at that point. Along the way, also, Charlie's son John started a company called Navigator Systems. They grew to be a pretty sizable business. It got bought by Hitachi. I think they were about $20 million in revenue, somewhere around there when they got acquired. And same thing, like all of a sudden, John and I are talking about different things, and I'm helping him with his business, giving him feedback on things. He's giving me feedback on things, and I kind of have in my head that I might have been for some project I was doing one of his first customers for some spreadsheet thing that he did. We had a joint customer, a company in South Bend, Indiana, called Mittler Supply. They came through a Harvard professor that Charlie was very close to, Linda Applegate. And we ended up, spending a lot of time. And when I say we, John's company, Navigator, and my company, and doing a bunch of work together there. Time continues to pass, and I'm now investing and very actively doing a bunch of stuff on the investing front. And it was right around 2000. The Feld Group's gotten to a certain size, and Charlie's starting to think about growing it more significantly. I'm at this organization that was the sponsor of the venture fund that I was part of, which was SoftBank. At the time, SoftBank was, well, by 2000, SoftBank was reasonably well known. When I started working with SoftBank in 1996, they weren't known at all. They just started to buy digital media companies in the United States, Ziff Davis and Comdex and things like that. And Masayoshi Son was I think as visionary then as he is today, but there wasn't really good understanding of exactly what he was trying to do. And I was part of the venture team in the U.S. called SoftBank Venture Capital, and we ended up investing in Feld Group. And the vision for that investment was that Charlie had the most expertise, we thought, certainly I thought, of anybody in corporate IT about how to think about strategy in the context of corporate IT. And so it wasn't just the execution of corporate IT, but also the strategy and the arc of it. And we had a lot of companies that were selling into the enterprise. And of course, the internet and the enterprise in 2000 were rapidly entangled around this, E something thing. If you remember, every major company started putting a little E in front of it, which was kind of in hindsight stupid, but that was the thing. And so we ended up investing in Feld Group. I joined Charlie's board and was part of the management committee and had just an incredible exposure now, depth-wise, into how Feld Group approached the transformation that they were doing, and was involved there until 2004 when EDS bought the company. So just lots of overlaps that go back and forth in different ways. And I'll just sort of end with a fun anecdote. The company that bought my first company, this would have been in 1993, was a company called Ameridata Technologies. And at the time, in 1993, networking was still dominated by Novell. And my business, which developed custom software for small, medium-sized businesses, then got bought by this much larger company. I became their chief technology officer. And it was at the time that there was the beginning of the evolution from Novell NetWare to Windows NT. So Microsoft had just come out with Windows NT Server. They're making a big deal about trying to be the server in the enterprise. They really hadn't displaced Novell yet, but they were making progress. And the Ameridata ended up being the largest Novell NetWare reseller in the world based on the acquisitions that the company was doing. And so we ended up having this really important 1 or 2 day meeting at Microsoft, where I don't know, 15 or 20 people from Ameridata flew out, and I was part of that contingent. And the Ameridata people were very sort of suit and tie, corporate type actors. I like to say that all of these companies were IBM adjacent. I mean, they sort of were salespeople and sales organizations in classical IT. And I was a guy with long hair, and I always wore jeans and a t-shirt around. And like me getting dressed up was wearing maybe a shirt that had buttons on it, but typically not one that I would tuck into my jeans. And so we go to this meeting at Microsoft, and we're in this gigantic conference room in the executive conference center or whatever they called it. And this is the first time I meet Steve Ballmer, and I've gotten this fortunate to spend some time with Steve a couple of other times in significant ways. And everybody's going around the room making introductions, and it's very polite. And there's, I don't know, a dozen Microsoft people in the room, and I mean, it's a big room of people. And they get to me on the table, and I say, Brad Feld, American Chief Technology Officer. And Balmer, in his sort of effusive way, looks at me and he says, Feld, are you Charlie Feld's kid? And you can just sort of feel all the Ameridata people cringe, like, what's coming? And no, no, he's my uncle. Oh, it's my dad's brother. I'm his nephew. And he says, that guy is single-handedly keeping OS2 alive. And what was kind of true. I mean, Charlie was very much like, for the different things he was doing, he was leveraging OS2 more profoundly than anybody else was at the time. And Barnes like, that guy. And you could just imagine all these Ameridata people thinking, why did we bring this guy to this meeting? And then Balmer, sort of in his wonderful way, cackles. He just laughs. We'll get them in the end. Charlie will be on my team. And what's the next person? So, there are just a lot of little moments like this that I treasure now as somebody I'm about to turn 60. And I think back on the last 40 years of my professional work, but even going back to when I was, 12 years old, he's had such a profound impact on me.
That's lovely reflections, Brad. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Very, very meaningful. I wonder, just briefly before we leave that first entrepreneurial venture behind, Feld Technologies. You started the business at MIT, which today might seem a bit more conventional. I certainly think it was probably less so in 1987. Why did you have the sort of risk tolerance at that point? What drove you to start a business as opposed to working for somebody else at the outset of your career?
Yeah, so it was unusual at that point, although there were some companies that were being started by people in college or people just recently graduated from college, but it was atypical. It was not the norm. And for me, it was actually the third company that I'd started. It was my first successful company. The first company I started as a freshman with three other fraternity brothers of mine. A guy named Dave Jilk, who ended up being my business partner at Feld Technologies and is still one of my closest friends. A guy named Samir Gandhi, who was a partner, and today is one of the senior partners at Excel, and has been an extraordinarily successful venture capitalist. And another guy, Andy Mina, who was my roommate. Like, we shared a double, and a longtime friend. So, like, the four of us, this is 1983. We are familiar with this idea that Apple is coming out with this computer with a graphical user interface because we know about the Lisa. We're all sort of computery nerds. And so we decide, again, I'm a freshman. All three of us were freshmen. Dave was a senior. All three of us decide to create a company. The company was called Martingale Software. And the idea of the company was to create software that had a graphical spreadsheet, because spreadsheets were a thing now. Lotus 123 was out, VisiCalc was out. We're in Boston, which was the home of both of those, right? Dan Bricklin lived in Boston and created VisiCalc. Mitch Kapoor lived in Boston, had created Lotus 123. And we were going to create a graphical thing that you could, grid spreadsheet, you could type numbers into and labels and words. And then you could press a button and it would create a graph. It would create a chart. It would create something from those numbers. That was the idea we had because that didn't exist at the time. Even Lotus 123 You could do that, but it was very clunky and weird, and it wasn't very easy to manipulate, and you had to sort of know a whole bunch of stuff. And our idea was we're going to make it super simple to do this. So we signed up for the as freshmen. We ended up getting into the Macintosh Developers Program very early on. And that was a program that Guy Kawasaki was running, and the Mac wasn't out yet. So we had to buy a Lisa. We raised a little bit of money from a guy named Dr. Scott, who with his son Brian had a company called Scott Instruments. And we ended up uh, doing an okay job of sort of maybe getting something to sort of work. I mean, programming for the Mac, and the very first Mac was miserable. Like you'd write this stuff on Elisa, you'd have to do like 67 swaps of little floppy disks. Eventually, you take your floppy disk and you'd stick in, these are those new 3.5 inch floppy disks. You stick it into the Mac. The Mac would churn for a little while, and then a little bomb would appear in the middle of the screen, which meant that your program crashed. And so we were getting down the path to this, and all of a sudden the Mac comes out, and voila, with the Mac ships Microsoft Excel, right? Like the thing was we were dead before we started. I then started a second company when I was a junior that also didn't work, and then eventually started Feld Technologies. The interesting thing through this arc was I really never thought about working for anybody. Right. So I had been exposed to computers so young in sort of the beginning of the rise of the PC. I was sort of interwoven in it. And your question was about risk tolerance. And I think the risk tolerance came from a simple place. My dad's a doctor and my mom's an artist. And I would attribute this to them in that my dad, even though he's a doctor, he started his own medical practice, which turned into a pretty big medical practice. He had when he retired, there were 4 or 5 partners. He was the senior partner. They had grown to a big business, and he treated it like a business. He thought of it that way. He was the doctor that all patients wanted to go to. Right? He had just amazing, amazing sort of bedside manner, touch, engagement. Today you go to the doctor and the doctor's typing on a computer or whatever. I mean, my father looked you in the eye. He spent time with you. He really engaged with you, but he viewed his practice as a business. So I got that from him. And then I saw my mother, who was a professional artist day in, day out. She went to the studio and created stuff. And, I kind of never really thought about, I need to have a career, I need to have a path, I need to build credibility or whatever. I had just sort of thrown myself into it. And, my heroes at the time were people like Mitch Kapoor, Bill Gates, Steve Case at AOL, who I've become good friends with. These were people that just sort of started something where there was nothing previously, and I love that idea. That was so captivating to me.
Very interesting. I will also want to ask you at a very early age, basically about the time you started Feld Technologies, you also began angel investing. And what led to that? Again, it's at a time presumably where you did not have enormous wherewithal and a need to deploy capital that you just accrued. What had you thinking that this was also an interesting area to influence the technology landscape?
Yeah, so the timing was dislocated a little bit. I started Feld Technologies in 1987. I sold it in 93 in the fall in November, and I made my first angel investment in early 1994.
Ah,
The way that path unfolded, Felt Technologies was started with $10. We didn't have any money, so it was. I bought 6 shares of stock for $1 a share. My partner Dave bought three, and my dad bought a share. My dad was an advisor, so he had 10% of the company. But we sold the company. We had 10 shares of stock, and fortunately, they were worth more than $1 each. Prior to that, like I had already been making some money, and I had this understanding of the value of not getting paid just for my time, but for the creation of something that had economic value. And where that came from was my between my senior year in high school and freshman year in college, I worked for a husband and wife company called Petcom in Dallas, Texas. It was Helen and Chris Aves. Again, early mentors of mine, amazing experience working with them. And it was just the two of them and me. And Chris wrote all the software. Helena was a sort of content expert. She was a geologist, and it was in their business was writing software for the oil and gas industry. And they hired me. I ended up writing two products for them. One called PC Log, which did well log analysis, which was a highly technical thing that previous to this software was completely manual. And then I wrote a piece of software called PC Economics. It did economic forecasting for oil well production. This is 1983, 84. So it's before the oil and gas crash. And so in Dallas, Texas, it was sort of the center of the economic world around all of this stuff. There's a kind of ironic twist to the story is that their competitor was a company called David P. Cook and Associates. I think that was the name. And when the oil and gas company crashed, he took his company and turned it into Blockbuster. And just the software then was used for that. Chris and Helena paid me $10 an hour. So I learned pretty quickly that if I worked 80 hours a week in the summer, I'd made twice as much money if I worked 40 hours a week. That was pretty easy math. But they also gave me 5% royalty on all the software sales for my products. And so I'm in college, freshman college, and I'm getting a check for, $1,000 or $2,000 one month. One month I got a check for over $10,000 because it had a particularly good month. I took my entire fraternity out to dinner at the Chinese restaurant across the street, a place called the Mandarin. And after dinner, I still had $8,000 left. So it wasn't that I had this huge amount of money, but I understood this sort of leverage of building a thing that has economic value independent of the time that you're getting paid for. When I sold Feld Technologies in 1993 to Ameridata, I made a couple $1,000,000. I got some cash, got some stock options. They're a publicly traded company, so I had the experience of watching the stock go up and down and up and down, and having to deal with that emotionally in my late 20s. And when I started making angel investments, I decided that it was kind of at the very beginning of the commercial internet, right? So 1994 was, .com. You were able to have commercial .coms, I think in 1993 was the first year that could happen. And I was in Boston in the middle of MIT. I was a 28-year-old successful founder. I just exited a company. And all of a sudden, I'm in all these interesting conversations because I had really also built this community of people around me. I didn't have any know who my peers were until about 1990. And by 1993, all of a sudden, in MIT, there's a bunch of companies getting started, people coming out of school, starting companies that become .coms. And I'm that MIT student who in 87 had built a business. And I wasn't the only one, there were others. But there were a group of us that were kind of in the middle of everything. And I just decided if I liked the people and I was interested in the product, I'd invest in it. My very, very first investment was in a company called NetGenesis, which I became chair of. There are four founders. One of them, Rajat Bhargava, is still one of my closest friends. Today, he's running a company called JumpCloud, which is a very large company that is the alternative to Microsoft Active Directory or Intune. And he and I have done 8 companies together, a handful that were very successful, a couple that didn't work. And the other person who invested in that company as an angel investor at the very beginning was a guy named Will Herman, who had been a successful founder who I became friends with through my friend Dave Jill, who after Martingale didn't work, Dave went to work for Will's startup. And it was Will and I's very first angel investment. And to sort of talk about the linkages, we talked about the linkages with Charlie and John, and I left Kenny out, but my brother Daniel, who worked for Techstars, which I was a co-founder of for many years, and Daniel and I are working on some projects again today. The sort of long-term interweaving of these relationships was so key. Raj and I have done 8 companies together. Will and I have invested in a ton of things over the years. We have a board meeting for JumpCloud on Wednesday here in Boulder. Will is the lead director on the board of JumpCloud. We're going to end up having a dinner that will include Dave Jilk, who lives here in Boulder. The other founders of NetGenesis, one of them, Matt Cutler, is a founder of a company in our portfolio today at Foundry Group and still a close friend. Neil Robertson, who I think was the first non-founder employee, ended up starting several companies that we funded at Foundry, including one that was extremely successful that Raj co-founded called Service Metrics, which Exodus ended up buying before Exodus blew up. So you have all of these relationships. And if I step back from it over a long period of time and think about it, the relationships are ones, you have one side of the world where people talk about it's business, it's just business, it's a transaction. Like you have to sort of manage that. And then you have another set of people in the world that really view the relationships as non-transactional. There's a lot more substance underlying the relationships. There's a lot of, pick your favorite word, empathy or emotional engagement. And they're friendships. They're friendships in addition to business relationships. And they're friendships that survive failure. They're friendships that survive disappointment. They're friendships that, survive things that don't go the way you think they would go. And when I look back, that's a key part of my own personal experience. And today, when you think about angel investing, in 1994, I did about 40 investments between 94 and 96 with my own money. So I was doing about an investment a month. In 1994, that was considered insane. An angel investor might make a couple of investments a year. Today, doing an investment a month, if you're an angel investor, not that atypical in terms of networks and how angel investment works and how those networks work. But I was really sort of in this beginning phase of that kind of a creation of thing. And it really had a huge impact on the way I thought about the world. I also told Amy that we would, my wife's name is Amy Batchelor. I told her that we would never have less than $100,000 in the bank. So that was kind of the rationale for why I was doing all these prolific angel investments. I was young. I figured, worst case, if all of the angel investments go to zero, I'm still fine. And I do remember having to tell Amy we had less than $100,000 in the bank because I had poor impulse control. And anyone who's ever been an angel investor knows that it takes a while to get the money back. But my timing was great. I mean, I had a lot of things that were very successful in the sort of run up to the internet bubble, 98, 99, 2000, before the internet bubble collapsed. And so as an angel investor, that was a hugely lucrative experience. But also a very instructive one as an early stage investor, because I'll just sort of end with this on this thread. I did 40 investments, 20 of them were zeros. 3 of them, each individually returned more than 100 times my investment. So just those 3, and I invested the same amount of money in each company. I had a pretty consistent strategy. So if I invested 40x, I had 3 companies that gave me back more than 300x.
Yep.
And then the other 17 or so companies, got some of my money back, or I made 1 times my money or 2 times my money. A couple of them made, 5 times my money, 10 times my money. And it really helped me understand that part of the angel investing, seed investing, early stage investing is something that has essentially a lot of failure in it, but that's a key part of it. It's something I think a lot of people in large companies just don't understand and struggle with. I think today they probably understand it better, but in the 90s, risk aversion, especially in the context of pre-internet bubble, working with these young companies, large corporations, were very sort of careful about what they did. And, the irony, of course, is that if you look inside large organizations, the number of projects that fail look very similar to the way companies fail.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, my metaphor had always been, from a risk perspective, everything is just an experiment. The creation of any company is an endless series of hypotheses, of which you run an experiment, most of which fail. And the key is to learn from the failure, run another experiment with a new hypothesis that incorporates that learning until you find something that works, and then do a bunch more of that. And I think large companies are extraordinary at, when they find something that works, doing a lot more of that. And I think the difference, interestingly, around the world of innovation was that large companies generally are much less good at running those early experiments, having them fail, and then continuing to experiment. So they tend to either wait to see some other body experiment that works and then try to emulate it or try to buy it. That became the modality today. And in some industries like pharma, it's so extreme. Like there's no big pharma innovation. They just wait till there's an invention from a separately funded company, and then they buy that and they pay a lot of money for those things because they know they can scale them up. In IT and technology, I think it's much more diffuse. But if you step back and say, why did Zoom exist in a world where Cisco controlled that market, owned that market? Why did Cisco get to be that leader when Microsoft, uh, you know, had this opportunity with Skype, with Teams, not with Teams, with Placeware, and even before that, had total control over all the email infrastructure in these companies. And it just comes back to this challenge. And maybe if we talk about some of the innovation dynamics going on today, that the difference between controlling a market and trying to create something new where something didn't exist before.
Well, let's that's a great segue. Let's talk about your perspectives on innovation today and how what you've learned across time now, multiple decades in, a lot of failures, but a lot of successes as well. Learning from each of those, incorporating that into your new investment theses or areas that you're investing in. What has you excited today as you think about innovation?
Why don't I give two quick examples of different categories that were created by startups, of which, as an investor, I've enjoyed the success from, but I'll show the sort of arc through it. And I'll do them in non-traditional or non-obvious answers because it'd be easy to give examples from B2B SaaS software and things like that. So I'll do some that are a little harder because there's an enormous amount of innovation right now that's still happening, of course, in software and AI as a category. But if you look at things like space, quantum, the thing called defense tech, which in a lot of cases is hardware related with software, like those categories are categories that historically, they've had very sort of deeply entrenched incumbents that today are being completely decimated by fast growing startups and very disrupted by the way that those companies are working. You could look at digital advertising and have a long conversation about how the traditional media industry has been dramatically disrupted by that. But let me take a different categories. There are two that I've been very deeply involved in. The first was something that today people sort of take for granted, which is the idea of a wearable. The idea that the thing that you wear on your wrist is a digital device that does a bunch of stuff besides just tell time. And when I was a kid, I got one of the very, very first calculator watches that TI made because I lived in Dallas and TI was in Dallas. And I remember that, having an red LED with a calculator on the watch. And of course, that's pretty nerdy, but it was awesome. I mean, just for me, it was just awesome. This idea of having that as I don't know, maybe I had a Star Wars one or something. Like it was so cool. And in 2010, the category that today is called a wearable didn't exist. There was no category. So, the iPhone came out in 2007, but there was no. I don't remember when the Apple Watch came out, but it was like 2015 or something like that. I invested in a company very early. They had about 10 people called Fitbit, and at the time, the Fitbit all it had on its sort of face, you didn't even wear it on your watch. You like put a little clip on your belt. That was the best it had. And the little clip had like a color thing on it, but that was it. It didn't have any numbers or anything like that. And, that company ended up creating the category of wearables. And, the first wearable device that actually had numbers on it, which was sort of very painful experience, almost put the company out of business, was something called the Fitbit Force. And it had, again, little LED numbers on it. And it told you the number of steps you took each day. And that was it. That was the only thing on the display. And that product, which was one of maybe the fastest growing, at the time, the fastest commercial launch of a new product, ended up having an issue with skin irritation. And they had to take that product off the market and do a recall. And that was brutal. And so one of the experiences I've had with every successful company I've been involved in is at least one near-death experience. And a lot of the startups have died, right? So they actually did die. But in Fitbit's case, they navigated through it. It was really painful. If anybody listening needs to needs help with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, something I'd never heard of before this. My email is brad@feld.com. Feel free to give me a call. Although I'm not sure if anybody works at the Consumer Safety Product Commission anymore, based on all the government stuff that's been going on. And that company went public and today is owned by Google. And that's a category. That was a hugely successful investment for us. We subsequently, after we exited that investment, invested in a company called Whoop. Whoop is a company that makes a wearable, which I'm wearing, but it doesn't have a screen. And the vision of Whoop is different. The vision of Whoop is to be an invisible health device that tracks everything about you, not just steps and fitness. And much of the innovation that you see, if you have a wearable of any sort, including an Apple Watch, a lot of stuff around sleep, and sort of the fidelity around that. HRV was kind of one of the things that Whoop really popularized. And it's a software and subscription-based product. It also has become an extraordinarily successful company. And they just came out with a product last week that integrates lab data into the Whoop. And so if you think of the Whoop, it's collecting a bunch of data about you. It has this enormous database of information about you. Plus, it has this huge amount of data about lots of other people who have similar demographics as you. And so in the background, all anonymously, it's doing all of this machine learning to understand how your health span is based on your data and calibrated to you, and then incorporating new inputs like all your blood work. So we've had this arc, I guess 15 years now, of these two companies in this category that have been extraordinarily successful as companies and have generated a huge amount of innovation that if you look at other companies sort of adjacent or doing similar things, many of the ideas get incorporated into other companies, but that's okay. That's how innovation works. The other example I'd give just quickly is 3D printing. And for anybody that's listening that's in a business that does manufacturing, my guess is you've got 3D printers in your manufacturing infrastructure at this point, whether they're industrial grade, large 3D printers or desktop 3D printers. In 2010, the idea of a desktop 3D printer didn't exist, right? There were these companies like Stratasys and 3D Systems, and there was this big hype in sort of late 2000, 2007, 8, 9, 10 about how 3D printing was going to be this way to transform advanced manufacturing and da-da-da-da. And I didn't buy the thesis of 3D printing by itself, but I had seen HP take printers and go from these printers where when I was in college, initially, if you wanted to have something on a laser printer, you had to walk to a building and you had to print from something that was connected to something. We had an internet at MIT, we had a network at MIT, so you could print from not the building, but then comes off on this gigantic machine with, if everybody remembers, those pages that had your name on the front of it that reminded you that it was yours. And I had a very early initial HP laser printer, the very first edition I bought one when I was in college, and it was awesome. I had line out the door, people that wanted to use my printer, and they'd bring their little floppy disk into my bedroom and they put it in the computer and print out. And of course, that was a, I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000 printer. Remember, I was getting good checks from my company, and I think the company that Petcom probably they probably bought me the printer. Nah, I probably bought it for myself. But by the time I got it, and what happened was, today for $100, $150, everybody has their printer, right? And it's a printer and a scanner and a copier and and a fax machine to the extent that you ever need that anymore, because you can just digitize the thing and email it. So I had that mental model that these gigantic 3D printers could work on the desktop. And I ran into this company called MakerBot. And MakerBot essentially invented, the team at MakerBot were part of an open source project called RepRap that turned into the first MakerBot. And the very first ones you had to physically assemble by hand. They were kit. And that company ended up creating the category, got bought by Stratasys, one of the very large public companies that really couldn't decide what they wanted to do with it. Like I think half of Stratasys's management team believed in the future of desktop 3D printing, and half of Stratasys's management team just wanted it to disappear because it was disrupting their business. We went on to fund a couple more companies in this category. I'm on the board today of Formlabs, private company, which is now the largest 3D printing company in the world. And as a business, it's now larger than both 3D Systems and Stratasys, growing very, very quickly, sort of dominant in that category. And then we also invest in a public company called Xometry that's actually a marketplace for 3D printed devices, and it's been hugely successful as a business. So like using domain knowledge and understanding of certain categories, and rather than just trying to invest in the next hot thing, for me, it's always been more of a strategy of understanding a category, trying to be a category creator, doing something new in a category, and then over a long period of time, continuing to invest in things and knowing that some of the stuff that you do in that category isn't going to work. You're gonna try some things, not going to work, but that if you can be embedded within what's happening as an investor and a founder, that's really interesting.
Very interesting indeed. Just in brief, so wearables and 3D printing areas that you've invested early, learned a lot, continued investing, parlaying gains in some places into new investments in the next category killer, perhaps. Are there other swim lanes, other topics that you're in that kind of
Yeah, well,
on that pathway that you would highlight?
yeah, I do a couple for me personally, separate from my partners at Foundry, but I've been investing in email since 1994. I'm an email guy. I love email. I still use email more than I use anything else in terms of communication medium. And I was an investor in the very first email service provider. So that was a category that didn't exist. The whole idea that you would do that. Now, this isn't spam. This is using email infrastructure for marketing email or transactional email. And that company was called Email Publishing. Not very creatively named. And I was effectively the angel investor and a co-founder of that company. I was chair of it for a while. It ended up merging with a public company and being one of the original sort of internet companies that ended up creating this whole category. At Techstars, which I co-founded, we also there were a number of other companies along the way. Enterprise company people might remember is a company called Return Path. They ended up focusing on this area called email deliverability. And email deliverability was a challenging problem because all of a sudden, all of the different email clients had different, display factors, and you're sending HTML email, and a bunch of the HTML email is gunky and depends on which client you're using. There's a lot of anti-spam stuff that's proliferated. And there's a lot of challenges if you're sending email with getting your email through, especially marketing related email. They were on the front end of canned spam and really sort of all the compliance around opt-in, opt-out email. We were investors in a company called Postini. I don't know if people remember Postini. We invested very early. Actually, not early. It was interesting. Postini was, we were a Series D investor. When I say early, Postini almost failed, and then we invested in it. So Postini had sort of a thing they were trying to do that didn't really work. And I remember when we invested in it, spam had become this huge problem. They were trying to be a universal messaging platform. That was universal email messaging platform. That was their starting point. Spam's now a problem, and everybody's coming out with desktop spam tools. So you're installing, your McAfee anti-spam or Norton anti-spam, whatever it was on your desktop. And there were a whole proliferation of companies that were created to do things that were on your desktop, or they plugged in, to your Outlook through an Outlook plugin or something. And it was really pretty horrific to like try to deal with it, even as an individual, but let alone as an enterprise. And Postini created the first cloud-based anti-spam company. And so you pointed your MX record at Postini servers, and all your mail flowed through Postini servers first, and they quarantined anything that they thought was spam and then forwarded on to your email servers, anything else. And so we saw them just as they were starting to do that, and their existing investors, who were all early stage investors, were kind of worn out. And we did what in venture land is called a recap, where we invested at a relatively low valuation, cleaned up some stuff in the cap table. And the existing investors still had good ownership. In the end, everybody was extremely happy because I think Google bought it for $600 million or something like that. And the founder of that company, Scott Petrie, one of the technical co-founder, uh, who today is running a company that we're investors in called Authenticate, which is a secure browsing company, common theme. But again, an email sort of transformed this problem. Like within about 2 years, no corporation was downloading software and putting it on desktops to try to deal with email. They were doing it in the cloud. And Postini, was a dominant player. Now, interestingly, the Postini infrastructure became the core infrastructure for a lot of Gmail and a lot of the current Google Workspace email infrastructure that people have was really built off of that starting point for Postini. So email would be a good example of that sort of an arc. And for me, when I think about today, a problem that I'm playing around with, it's really, um, I'm trying to get my mind around how it works, which is adjacent, it's sort of AI adjacent, is a collision of two ideas. One idea is I think that we as an industry have done the end user a huge disservice. I was a very early investor in Zynga. For those of you that played Farmville or Mafia Wars or Words with Friends, you do not have me to thank because I wasn't driving any of it, but I was an investor on the board. You have Mark Pincus to thank for all that. And that was another example of just a super successful investment. But they really were the first company that figured out how to engage people in a significant way using what are today the very, very common and pervasive usages of any sort of reinforcement loops with any online anything. I would suggest that a lot of the tools that Facebook uses today were not actually, to retain and engage people, were really derivative from a lot of the things that Zynga had figured out. Zynga's platform was Facebook, and there was a sort of a very much a complicated relationship between the two companies. But not just the idea of building these loops that kept people engaged in using it, wanting to engage more, whether you call them addiction loops today or whatever you want to call them, but also monetizing the end user for that, where the direct monetization was to pay for more access to something, and the indirect monetization was advertising. So when I look back on that arc, I think we've abused, we, the technology industry, have abused the end user on two dimensions. One, obviously, is the whole dimension around data and privacy. And the other dimension is around monetizing the end user rather than focusing on value to the end user. And my favorite enterprise example of that today is a company called Epic. And I think probably everybody listening uses Epic software because they're dominant. They have the primary hospital information system, which is a problem that's been going back to Ross Perot, in the early formation of EDS. And Epic as a company has done an extraordinary job of building a very, very successful, very large company. I went to get a blood draw in my hospital today, and they now have Epic kiosks, so I don't have to check in with a human being. They have like a little kiosk, and I check in with my kiosk. I'm not quite sure why I need a fancy branded kiosk to do that versus doing it from my computer at home, but never mind. And if you think about it as an end user, I have I think now 7 Epic portals because I spend time at different hospitals. I have a couple of places that I live, so I have different hospitals and different places that I live, and then I go to the Cleveland Clinic every now and then for an executive health program. And I've had to go to a doctor in San Diego, so I got an Epic portal for that doctor. And then I have an executive health program that I do every year at Canyon Ranch. By the way, they don't use Epic. That one has a totally different portal. And my health data, I keep all my health data, is 20 years of PDFs in a folder in my computer that fortunately I'm smart enough to upload to Dropbox. So at least I have a backup. But if I want to figure out what my cholesterol is over the last 20 years and what the trend is, I'm like literally looking at PDFs and typing a number into a spreadsheet. It's just stupid. Even within Epic, I can't look across all Epic systems for my data. And I have to get an MRI every 6 months for a particular reason. And the only reason I get the MRI every 6 months is to make sure that the thing that the MRI is looking at doesn't change in size. That's it. That's the only thing. There's nothing else. It's just one thing. Did it change in size? And we live in Aspen a good chunk of the year. And I went to the hospital in Aspen, which I'd never gotten an MRI at before. Super easy, another Epic portal, blah, blah, blah. Doctor calls it in, all this stuff. Get my MRI, go home. The radiologist, sends me the note the next day because he reads the MRI. It has nothing to do with the change in size because he has no access to any of my other data other than, right? So this is problem number one, is this idea that the end user should be the center of the universe, and not for 100% of end users, but for 1% or 2% or 5% of end users who can afford to pay for value for themselves, figuring out how to change how some of this stuff works so that the data actually belongs to the end user again, and the end user has control across the data across other systems. So I'm very sort of playing with that. The other, which this one is more, and AI is a big part of that because of the way that you can now deal with and process data in a different way. The other is this notion that, and we hear it, it's hyperbolic what we're hearing right now about AI eliminating jobs and the transformation of how work's going to work and all that sort of thing. And like Microsoft making an announcement about how AI is making their business more effective to we laid off 6,000 people. I'm like, Microsoft lays off 6,000 people every year because they just do, top grading. So like, what's that about? That sounds more marketing than reality. But I think the hyperbolic nature of it is useful to signal is that the way we work using this new technology, which is being called AI, but for anybody in the technology industry that has been through every sort of step function, go back in time, mobile, cloud, client server, PC desktop, like these are really radical transformations. And the AI transformation is happening faster and with more intensity than any that I've been experienced since 1987. But from my frame of reference, it feels and looks like that same kind of step function transformation of the technology. One of the things that I've lived in for 35 years, 40 years, is building companies from scratch. And the number of things that you do at a company when you're starting from scratch that at some point of scale that involves the same work, that are people doing the same work, is endless. And so I'm working on a thesis, and I'm calling it Zero Employee Company, but I'm trying to figure out which of those pieces can really be completely automated versus which of those pieces can't. And completely automated is important because with traditional software, automated doesn't work because it's not that you're trying to systematize the thing. It's that you actually have to be responsive to all the data that you're getting. And then you have to figure out how to deploy and control and modify and change it. And that's true for the software development cycle as well, because the software development cycle is radically changing because of the use of AI tools. And I think AI and software development and AI and customer service are the two easy buttons here because they're dealing with a constrained set of stuff. So you're seeing those categories grow really quickly. But like, I didn't write software professionally again after 1992. I wrote it professionally till 92. I'd learn a programming language every couple of years just for fun. So, I know Ruby and I know Python. I couldn't do anything. The tooling was too complicated for me. It was moving too quickly. I had an 80-hour-a-week job as an investor. Like, I was just too busy. All of a sudden, with contemporary technology, I can build web-based applications using Cursor as my environment and using Claude as my underlying model and using Vercel as my deployment engine and using Supabase as my database and using Clerk as my authentication system by kind of talking to the tool interacting with it. I know enough code and I know enough about systems to know how to organize it and to know what to tell it and how to tell it and how to debug it and how to sort of work through it. Like I have enough of that historically. And yeah, there's a learning curve. I've been playing with this stuff for 9 months since the holidays last year. It took me a while to get up the learning curve. But what I'm seeing as I'm now up the learning curve is a combination of the learning curve and being up that curve and the pace of uh, change, the rapid evolution of not just the AI models, but the tooling around it, like Cursor and how it integrates with everything, is dramatic. So I'm trying to think a couple of years ahead in terms of how this stuff is going to work, um, rather than simply replacing existing tools. And of course, you know, from my frame of reference, that's kind of the fun of what I've been doing for a long time. So I'm playing with that again now.
That's really interesting. Look, I want to speak a little bit about your latest book. Give first: the power of mentorship. In your book, you talk about how give first means being willing to put energy into a relationship or system without defining the transactional parameters. However, importantly, it's not altruism. You note that you can and should expect to get something back, but you don't know when, from whom, in what form, and over what time frame. Talk a little bit about the thought process behind this. Clearly, something you've incorporated into something that you've benefited from, something you've incorporated into the way in which you work with others, companies you invest in. Importantly, though, companies you have not yet invested in, or individuals you've not yet invested in. Talk about the philosophy behind this, if you would.
Yeah. Well, the definition you just gave is right on, and you used a word that's really important, which is philosophy. Give first is a philosophy, not a religion. A religion is follow a set of rules, and theoretically, good things happen to you somewhere in this life or the afterlife, maybe. And much of our society operates with rules, and many of businesses operate with rules and frameworks and things like that. I like to talk about it as a philosophy because for a philosophy, it's a set of ideas that you incorporate into the way you do things, and you pick and choose from every philosophy. There's not a canonical. I am this kind. I'm an existentialist, and here are my rules. No, 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 no. I mean, it's recursive existentialism. You define your own meaning. If you're not allowed to define what that means, then it's not existentialism by definition. And pick your philosophy; it doesn't matter. Um, Interestingly, the linkage between this philosophy and mentorship is core. Um, this came from, I first started thinking about it in 2010 when I started trying to understand and talk about another concept that I labeled, which is startup communities. In 2010, that phrase didn't exist. I wrote a book in 2012 called Startup Communities. And at the time, people were talking about two things. One was you'd hear this phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem or innovation something or other. Remember, 2010, we were still in the financial crisis or just coming out of it. Like the whole world was going to get nationalized. You know, banks weren't going to exist anymore. Money didn't work. Your ATM wasn't going to work. There was kind of moments in time that were pretty fragile. And it was a very difficult couple of years for society. But by 2010, it was kind of normalizing again. And people were starting to talk about startups in a meaningful way as the path out of the financial crisis. The next generation of innovation is going to come from these newly created companies, which of course ended up being true. And people would talk about different geographies, and you'd hear Silicon Valley, different, and they talk about cities, and they'd say Silicon Valley. And like anybody knows Silicon Valley, it's not a city; it's a huge region between, San Francisco and San Jose. It's actually north of San Francisco, even because you go up to Marin County. There's some interesting stuff there. Boston, which is not really a city. I mean, the Boston metro area is like 40 or 50 little cities. They're all small towns. New York, which of course is 5 cities. People call them boroughs, but they're separate cities. And then Boulder, where I lived. And like Boulder could fit, the entirety of Boulder would fit in one square block in Manhattan. Like it'd be tight, but we could squeeze all 100,000 people into it somehow, the high rise and stuff like that. So it caused me to think about this idea of building a startup community anywhere in the world. And today I make a very strong assertion that every city in the world that has at least 50,000 people should have a startup community as part of it, in the same way that as an engine of a healthy city, you have the arts, you have education, you have city parks and beautiful spaces. Like these are things that are the engine of a city. And having a startup community is another piece of that engine for a variety of reasons. In that book, I wrote a little chapter called, or not a chapter, a paragraph called "Give Before You Get." That was the precursor to "Give First." And hashtag "Give Before You Get" when Twitter's only 140 characters isn't a particularly good use of your 140 characters, so it got turned into "Give First" at some point. But I was using this idea to say, if you want to get everybody involved in your startup community and you really want to get something moving and you want to get a flywheel turning, you want everybody to give before they get, to be willing to put energy into the system without knowing what they're going to get back. And it's not altruism. You're going to get something back. You just don't know when, from whom, over what time. So that's where it came from. Looking forward, that became the mantra and sort of the embedded characteristic of a value system at Techstars, which I'd co-founded in 2006, that runs accelerators all over the world and has become a very large investor. Today, we're over 5,000 investments globally that we've made at the pre-seed level. So literally the inception of the company. And then on the other end of the spectrum, when I look backwards, was kind of how I was behaving going back to 1990s. And when I thought about it, it was kind of like the relationship I had with Charlie when I was 12 years old, right? So I can kind of put a through line through so many of these things. I mentioned this guy, Dr. Scott, or sorry, Mr. Scott. His son was Dr. Scott. Mr. Scott was, the first investor in that failed company, Martingale Software. But when I was a teenager in high school, I was a patient of my dad's, knew him, and somehow we got connected. I don't remember exactly what happened. Maybe he was a patient of my dad's. But he would have lunch with me a couple times a month. And, he got me out to see him and Brian, his son, at their company. It was, why was he spending time with this 15-year-old precocious, nerdy kid? Right. And I link that to this idea of mentorship, which as a word has existed for a long time, but wasn't really used in startups very much. And in big companies, typically was a hierarchical dynamic. A mentor was somebody senior in the organization, and the mentee was somebody young. And the mentor's responsibility was to help the mentee navigate, I like to say, navigate the hierarchy of the big company. And I wanted to try to define something different, which was this relationship between mentor and mentee, where both learn from each other. And, I described the Charlie story where, I learned a lot from Charlie at the beginning. I don't know whether he learned anything from me at the beginning, but there was a moment in time where that one up, one down relationship became a peer relationship. We became peers. And that is the magic trick of mentorship, is when the mentee and the mentors become peers. And when, for me as a mentor of someone, I learn more from the mentee than they learn from me. And somebody says, well, why do you bother doing it? It's like, are you kidding? Like the opportunity to understand and learn new stuff, especially, okay, great. So I'm almost 60 and I've got a whole bunch of knowledge and wisdom and experience with a bunch of things. But do I understand what's going on? Do I know what's actually happening in the mind of a 23-year-old who's the next wave of innovation and changing the way things work, or has a totally different worldview than I do about how the world should work? And oh, by the way, they're the future, not me. And so it's a blessing to be able to be involved with people like that and to actually have people like that want to engage. Even when I'm in a place where, yes, of course, I have a lot of power, yes, I have a lot of financial resources, but knowledge is the thing that is the fuel. And that peer relationship becomes power. And I'll give two examples of that. One is the son of one of my partners at Foundry, Quinn McIntyre. He's Ryan McIntyre's son. Quinn's 21, and he's probably most like me at 21 of anyone I've ever met. And I've known Quinn since he was born. We're extremely close friends. He's involved in amazing stuff. And anytime Quinn wants to talk, I'm happy to talk because I always learn something. I don't hover over Quinn. He's 21. He's building his own life. He's figuring out the way he wants to go. I'm not trying to figure out how to take advantage of Quinn's world or build off of that or have him involved in my things. No, I just want to be there for him to learn from, and I want to learn from him, and I want to be friends in this kind of emotionally intimate relationship that plays out over a long period of time. And if that turns into something that has a business opportunity for him or for me, awesome, that's fine. But that's not the driver, that's the outcome. Another example is a guy in his 30s, Sam Ritchie, and Sam's the son of a very longtime friend of mine, Bill Ritchie. Bill Ritchie, people may know this name now, is Dennis Ritchie's brother. Dennis passed a few years ago, but if anybody ever has used Unix or C, they have Dennis Ritchie to thank for that because there's a very famous, again, my guess is some people will know this book, a white book with a blue C on the cover that's called Kernighan and Ritchie. And if you learn the C programming language, that everybody starts with Kernighan and Ritchie. That's where you start to learn how to program in C. And I didn't know Dennis directly. I think maybe interacted through Bill once or twice. But I was really close with Bill. Well, I met Sam when Sam was like 5. My nickname with Sam, by the way, was Scary Man because I had long hair and I was kind of wild all the time. And I showed up one day and I kind of did the monster roar to the little kid. Arr. And so to this day, he calls me Scary Man. And he now lives in Boulder, which is totally independent of me, with 3 wonderful kids and an awesome wife, Jenna. And Sam is essentially the genetic path from Dennis in terms of software development. So Bill's a very creative guy. He created a company with his wife, Andrea, that it's called Binary Arts and then Think Fun. My guess is most people, if you ever bought a toy from a museum shop or something like that, one of the physical puzzles, it's a Think Fun puzzle. Um, but Sam has been an amazing software developer. He was one of the core engineers at Twitter, invented something called Hummingbird. That's one of the key pieces of infrastructure they have. And I mean, I spend whatever time I can with Sam because of exactly that. Like, again, he calls me when he needs advice, wisdom, feedback on something. Sometimes he just calls me to call me. And anytime we spend together, I'm always learning stuff from him. So that mentee-mentor relationship becomes a peer relationship. And maybe it's a last comment, and maybe it's part of what it could be part of what Charlie was doing when he was having me in these meetings that I had no business being in, is that we would talk afterwards, and maybe he'd learn something from me because I saw it a different way than he saw it. My 22-year-old eye was seeing it differently than his 50-year-old eye, or however 45-year-old eye, however old he was at the time. And I think that's a really powerful thing for people to think about in their work. Doesn't matter what kind of company you work for, what kind of work you're doing, constantly not viewing experience as equal to knowledge and insight, but as being adjacent to knowledge and insight. They're different things. And of course, someone who's older tends to have more experience than someone that's younger. But that person is not necessarily going to have more knowledge and insight into something. And interestingly, even if you're older than somebody else, in certain areas, your experience may not be more. And so, again, part of this book, this idea of give first and the philosophy is just engaging in a way without knowing what you're going to get back, shifting from a transactional world to a non-transactional world, viewing everything as positive sum versus zero sum. By definition, zero sum, the winner gets X and the loser gets minus X. And so the sum is zero. Positive sum, both parties benefit in different amounts, but they both benefit. And then the last, of course, which comes back to the beginning of the conversation, is this idea of multi-turn games. I mean, my relationship with Charlie spans, he's known me since I was born. So it spans almost 60 years. He knows me before I was born because I'm sure he put his hand on my mom's stomach. Maybe he didn't because that's not his shtick. Or maybe he did. I don't know. You have to ask him or my mom. And but like that relationship is a multi-turn game, long-term relationship. So those 3 things are the essence of Give First.
That's wonderful. I love that the conversation came full circle back to Charlie as well. It is a terrific read. I'll show it again. Give First by Brad Feld. Recommended to everyone watching and listening. And Brad, what a treat it's been for me to learn from you, to learn from your vast experience, the methods that you've used across time, the from your beginnings to your philosophies now codified across so many learnings, as you put it, through your successes, through your failures. I appreciate your willingness to share a bit about that with me today.
It's my pleasure. This was fun, Peter. Thanks.